You ever wonder how something totally new, like the internet, actually happens? How does it go from being some weird little experiment to something that completely rewires our world? Well, that's exactly the question we're going to dig into today.
All right, so to do that, we're going to be looking at the first chapter of Paul Jurowski's fantastic book, The Evolution of New Markets. We're essentially going to reverse engineer his argument to build a framework for how these new markets really get started, how they grow, and eventually how they mature. So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with why we even need a theory in the first place. Then we'll dive into the internet as a huge case study. After that, we hit a really interesting turning point, what the author himself calls the so what question. That's what will lead us to his basic premise, and from there, we'll see how we can use this whole framework to think about the future. Let's jump in. Okay, so first things first. If you want to have any hope of understanding where things are headed, you need a solid theory of how they got here. Gorowski totally gets this, but instead of starting with some dry, abstract model, he kicks things off with a massive, world-changing example that we all think we know pretty well.
And yup, you guessed it, that example is the internet. He uses it as this kind of anchor for his whole argument. It's the common ground, the shared story that he's going to use to build a much bigger, more powerful theory. And this timeline really tells the story, doesn't it? The internet didn't just appear out of thin air. I mean, look at this. It started as a government research project way back in the 60s, slowly morphed into ARPANET in the 80s, and then just exploded into public life with the World Wide Web in the 90s. And that infamous dot-com boom and bust, that wasn't a failure. It was more like a chaotic, super important stress test for this emerging new market. All right, so we've got the history, we've got the story, but right here is where Gorowski makes a really clever move. He knows that just telling a story isn't enough. It's time to shift gears from just history to an actual theory. And he does this in such a brilliant way. He literally uses this as a heading in his chapter. After he lays out that whole history of the internet, he kind of stops, turns to the reader, and basically asks, "That's a nice story, but so what?" It's such a great, provocative question, and it's designed to make us all stop and think a little deeper. Because, the story is just the data points. The real prize, the real goal, is to find the pattern that's hidden inside all that chaos. He uses this question as a pivot, to stop just describing what happened with one market and start building a real framework that can explain how any new market works. And that pivot takes us straight to his central argument. This is the big answer to that so what question. This is the core idea of the entire book. So here it is. The big premise is this. New markets aren't just born, they evolve. And that evolution is messy and unpredictable. It kicks off with some kind of new tech, then a whole flood of entrepreneurs rush in, all trying different things. And out of that messy, competitive chaos, a dominant design, basically a standard way of doing things, starts to slowly emerge. That is the turning point when a market really starts to grow up. But is this just a one-off theory that only explains the internet? Well, to prove it's a real universal pattern, Jurowski immediately pressure tests his idea against a totally different industry, the super high-stakes, specialized world of supercomputers. And this slide just lays it out so clearly. I mean, on the surface, these two markets look like they're from different planets, right? The internet was born from public research, supercomputers from niche government demand. The internet had thousands of dot-com entrepreneurs jumping in. The supercomputer market had just a handful of specialized firms. But, and this is the kicker, despite all those differences, the underlying pattern is exactly the same. They both took decades to mature, and both were fundamentally a long, messy search for that dominant design that would finally let them go mainstream. And this, right here, is where it gets really exciting, because once you have a reliable framework that explains the past, you can start using it to make sense of the present, and maybe, just maybe, get a better glimpse of the future. So now that his theory is battle-tested, Jurowski brings us full circle. He comes back to the internet, but now he's armed with this powerful new way of seeing things, a new lens to analyze where it might be going next. And the rest of the book is basically his plan to do just that. He builds his argument piece by piece. First, he really breaks down the chaotic early days of new markets. Then he zooms in on how those all-important dominant designs actually come to be. After that, he wades into the classic fight between scrappy entrepreneurs and big, established companies, and finally ties it all together to show how these patterns are shaping our entire economy. So let's boil it all down. What are the big things to take away here? Number one, New markets evolve. They are not an overnight thing. Number 2, they go through predictable stages, even if those stages look messy at the time. Number 3, the crucial signal to watch for is the emergence of a dominant design. That's the real game changer. And finally, if you get this pattern, you have a much sharper tool for analyzing all the new tech popping up today.
Which brings us to a final thought. And it's a question for you. Using this framework, what new market out there right now, maybe it's AI, maybe it's quantum computing, maybe something else, do you see going through this exact process? Can you spot that messy, chaotic phase? And do you see any signs that a dominant design might be starting to emerge?